kids. Welcome back. It's Review Sunday. Remember, every 10 weeks we have a Review Sunday. And if we were at church, we would be having donuts afterwards and puppets. Well, we can't have some of those things, but hopefully you got your little surprise in your packet and you are enjoying that, I hope. So we are going to do our memory verse song one last time this morning. So get up and get ready to sing.
Being rich in mercy because of the great love with which He loved us, even when we were dead in our trespasses, made us alive together with Christ. By grace you have been saved, by grace you have been saved. He loved us, even when we were dead in our trespasses. Made us alive together with Christ. By grace you have been saved, by grace you have been saved. We're alive, we're alive, we're alive. Oh yeah, we're alive. But God, being rich in mercy because of the great love with which He loved us, even when we were dead in our trespasses. Made us alive together with Christ. By grace you have been saved, by grace you have been saved. We're alive, we're alive, we're alive. Oh yeah, we're alive. We are A-L-I-V-E. We're alive, Christ is in me. We are A-L-I-V-E. We're alive, Christ is in me. Yeah.
All right, we've been studying about the southern kingdom of Judah, and we've been learning about some of their kings and their prophets and some of their young men. And some of the kings of Judah were good and some were not, right? Well, in our first lesson, we learned about the youngest king of Judah that was crowned. Do you remember how old he was? He was 7, and he had quite a story before that time. He had a grandmother who was evil, and she was trying to put all the young princes to death so that she could be the queen, even though she wasn't supposed to be. Well, all of his brothers were killed, but he had an aunt that was very brave, and she rescued him, took him to the temple, and she and her husband, the priest, kept him hidden for 6 years. And then, when he was 7, he was crowned king. He started out really good while his uncle, the priest, was helping him, but then if you remember what happened after his uncle died, he listened to some bad advice, and he turned away from the Lord. So sad. And he started worshiping idols. So he started well, but he did not end well. In our second lesson, we learned about another king. His name was Hezekiah, and he was remembered for doing many good things. He cleaned out the temple, he got rid of idols, he obeyed the Lord, and he trusted God. But he faced some really scary times. The Assyrian army came and camped all around Jerusalem, and he received a letter from their leader, from the king, and it said, "We are going to destroy you. Your God can't help you." Do you remember what Hezekiah did with that letter? He took it to the temple and he laid it before the Lord and he prayed. And do you remember how God answered? That night, 185,000 of the Assyrian army died during the night. When the rest of them woke up in the morning, there weren't enough of them left to fight the battle, and so they turned around and left and went back home. In our third lesson, we learned about two prophets who were alive when all these things were happening in Jerusalem. They were Isaiah and Micah. Micah wrote about a coming ruler who would be born in Bethlehem. He would be the one who would save people from their sins. This ruler would be eternal, with no beginning or end. Isaiah wrote about how this chosen one would be born and how he would die. God kept all these promises. They all came true with Jesus, even though they were written 700 years earlier. In our fourth lesson, we learned about another king who began ruling when he was very young. Do you remember his name and how old he was? It was Josiah, and he was 8. When he was a teenager, he began to follow the Lord with his whole heart. He destroyed idols, and he had the temple cleaned up and repaired. And while people were working on it, Hezekiah, the priest, found something that had been lost for many, many years. It was the scroll containing God's laws, probably the first 5 books of our Bible. When it was read to King Josiah, do you remember what he did? Maybe you remember Trevor played the part of him during that lesson. He tore his clothes to show that he was so sad, and he cried and he wept. And he said, "We have not obeyed the Lord. Our nation has gone against him." He followed the Lord his whole life. He finished well, and he is a really fun king to read about. In our 5th lesson, we learned about Jeremiah. He was a prophet, and God called him when he was a teenager. Do you remember he was not so sure about doing such a big job? He said, "I can't speak well," but he obeyed anyway. Do you remember that God told him to go to the potter's house? Do you remember what he saw there? He saw men making clay pots. And what happened when the clay pots got messed up? Do you remember? They were squished, and the man started over. Well, this was a warning for God's people. If they continued to sin, if they continued to worship idols, if they continued to not listen to the Lord, he was going to need to punish them. Well, did the people listen to Jeremiah's message? No, they didn't. They beat him and they put him in stocks. He cried. He's sometimes called the weeping prophet, remember, because he was so sad that his people wouldn't listen. Well, in our next lesson, we learned more about Jeremiah. He kept telling people over and over not to sin. Turn from your sin. Stop worshiping idols. Judgment is coming. But they still wouldn't listen to him. They beat him again, and they threw him in a cistern. One of the king's servants rescued him. But it wasn't long before the Babylonians came and circled the city of Jerusalem. They destroyed it. Jeremiah saw all this happen, but God kept him safe. We learned that God is just, he's patient, he gives lots of chances for people to repent and turn back. And even when judgment came, he did not forget about his people or stop loving them. In our next lesson, we learned about 4 teenage guys who were taken as prisoners to Babylon. Can you remember their names? Daniel, Hananiah, Mishael, and Azariah. They were chosen to be trained as the king's servants. He wanted them to forget their homes, though, and he wanted them to forget their gods. So do you know how he started that process? He changed their names, didn't he? Their new names were Belteshazzar, that was Daniel, Shadrach, Meshach, and Abednego. Well, Daniel and his friends, if you remember, refused to eat the king's food. Well, why did they do that? Because they wanted to obey the Lord. They resolved to follow him and obey all his commands. Well, what happened after the experiment of 10 days? They were found to be healthier, fitter, and better than the rest of the young men. At the end of the 3 years of training, when the 4 were brought before King Nebuchadnezzar, how could you tell that God blessed them? Well, they were wiser, smarter, they looked better, and they were more skillful than any of the other people. They were all given important leadership roles in Nebuchadnezzar's kingdom. The next week, we learned about Shadrach, Meshach, and Abednego. King Nebuchadnezzar had a huge statue built. Do you remember we built one here? and he ordered that everybody bow down to it when the music played. But these three guys, remember our word, resolve? They resolved not to do that. They were the only ones standing. So what was their punishment? I think you remember. They were thrown into a fiery furnace by a very angry king. Well, what happened? What did King Nebuchadnezzar see as he watched? They didn't burn up at all. In fact, there was a fourth man walking around with them. Well, the king ordered them to come out, and he was amazed that they didn't even smell like smoke. Even though King Nebuchadnezzar learned that our God is powerful, he still didn't turn from his pride. God warned him with a dream about a big tree being chopped down. I think you remember that. Daniel explained what the dream meant, and it came true 1 year later. Nebuchadnezzar lived like an animal out in the field for 7 years, eating grass. And when he finally humbled himself and understood that God is in control of all things, God gave his kingdom back to him. Last week, we learned that King Nebuchadnezzar died and a new king became in charge. And Daniel served under this new king. He was Belshazzar, and he decided to have a great big feast. And he and all his guests were drinking wine and having a great time when he had a bad idea. Do you remember what the bad idea was? He thought it would be fun to drink wine out of those special cups, the gold and silver ones that had been stolen from the temple in Jerusalem. So he ordered them brought, and they were all having a fun time drinking their wine out of these special cups, and then they started also praising and worshiping their false gods. Then do you remember what really odd thing happened? All of a sudden there was a hand, not attached to a body, and it was writing on the wall in their banquet hall. Daniel was sent for, and he explained what it meant. That very night, the city was surrounded by the Medes and Persians, and the king was killed. In his place, Darius the Mede became the next king. And we learned that he really, really liked Daniel, and his plan was to promote him to be the leader over everything. Well, some of the other leaders didn't like that, do you remember? And they plotted against Daniel. They tricked the king into making a law that said that everyone could not pray to any god except the king himself for 30 days. Well, Daniel was resolved still, even though he was an old man now, and he prayed anyway. What was his punishment? Do you remember? He was thrown into the lion's den. But what happened? An angel shut the lions' mouths, and he was safe all night long. King Darius was a mess. He couldn't sleep that night. He couldn't eat. He was so worried about Daniel. He had tried so hard to get out of this punishment, but he couldn't because it was law. So in the morning he went, and Daniel was just fine. He called Daniel, got him up out of that pit, and he made a new law for the whole land that said everyone was to worship and not say anything bad against the true God, our God. So that's our really, really quick review. Now your parents have a page of questions they're going to ask you, see how many you can get right. And then hopefully you got your little treat in your packet and you can enjoy that. You have a good week, and next week we'll start a brand new unit.